name is Adotei Brown. I'm an architect. I have been practicing for 45 years now. I am a partner of a private firm. The name is very long. It is Adotei Brown and Partners. We're a private practicing firm with currently 2 partners. That firm started with the name FC De Vega. It was a foreign firm then. Then 2 Ghanaian partners joined, and it became De Vega and Partners. A few years down the line, I joined the partnership, and it became De Vega Brown and Partners. And we've been practicing in this country for 59 years. Next year, the firm will be 60 years old. It was one of the first private practicing firms. I joined the partnership in 1978. We have designed a range of building projects, mainly bank buildings in the past, office buildings, and quite a number of industrial buildings also. It's difficult to talk about architecture in Ghana in a particular sense of the evolution or development of design of buildings, but I will attempt to do that, because in the past many of us didn't have formal education. However, I will give you some examples to try to illustrate the point. Because we didn't have formal education, a man who needed shelter started sleeping in caves, sleeping in the open, wherever there was shelter. And if you follow what the Guans have been saying about their shelter, the originals, those who originated from Ghana, as is said in history, their early dwellings were in caves. Then man needed to develop some shelter as their communities grew. So they turned to sticks, branches, twigs, found a way of weaving them together, found a way of building and strengthening their walls using mud, then went to the bush generally, found reeds, pulled them together, and formed lattice and put on the roof to protect themselves from weather. Some cases they provided some openings for ventilation and light, and in other cases they didn't. Take a case of buildings from the southern part of the country, where there's a lot more breeze and fewer wild animals. You should imagine that years ago, not too many years ago, when I was young, there were stories of wild animals coming close to the various settlements. When there was a burial, the following day, people will go and look at the graves and see whether wild animals had attacked the graves. There were stories of lions being not too far away from settlements in the northern part of the country. We had stories of Highness all over, and these formed how man protected himself. Initially, many of them didn't have doors. They just had some panels that they covered the buildings with. You started with a one-room building. Quite often it was rectangular or square. And you built the walls up and slept in the wall. The floor was of earth. That's what they could find around. And the walls were principally of mud or palm fronds, and the roof of thatch. There are some other cases which are different. If you go to the northern part of the country, the northeast, a lot of our districts have changed, so I'm going to be generalizing the description, otherwise I probably will get into trouble. The Savannah region, for example, has recorded a mosque, Larabanga Mosque, which many Ghanaians know about because it's all over. But that is the earliest known structure in Ghana that's recorded, and it was built about 1841 by a Muslim who traveled a lot in that region. It is influenced by what we call Sahel architecture. It's an architecture that you find as you go further north to Mali, to Sudan. That's where you get the influence of the Sahel. And their mud was used to a greater extent to build higher. The differences are that the walls of the buildings, of that particular building, reveal a lot of sticks protruding. But those sticks were out of necessity. They were used for maintenance of the building. So you used it to climb the building and you maintain it. The walls were plastered, whereas a lot of the walls in the south were not plastered then. They're plastered with a mixture generally of mud and cow dung, because that gave a better adhesion. And practically every year or after a heavy rainy season, the walls were again repaired and plastered. As time went by and we found more materials impervious to rain, the buildings were again painted with these things. But in the Larabanga Mosque and similar buildings in that area, you find that the roofs are flat, or near flat. And there are villages in that area that also have buildings which were put up with flat roofs. Some of them, for protection, built their road network on the roofs and climbed down to their various homes within the community. That way, it wasn't easy to attack them, or it wasn't easy for wild animals to also come into the buildings to attack them. The other influences to the east of the northern region were generally square or rectangular, square or circular buildings, which are also built of mud and generally had the thatch roofs. There were also flat roofs there. But the typical fashion was to build one unit. As your needs grew, you built another unit near it. If you had a family, the general trend was that your son or someone will build another unit attached to yours, but with a separate compound. And you build compounds as you went along. That's in the north. The animals will be penned in one small area. In the south, we tended to build and go into a U shape. You build one unit, you build a kitchen attached to it, then your children built other units, and you formed a U. After that, it was time to extend, perhaps to a separate compound. But that's how we developed our architecture. Then there were influences which you find in Ashanti, where we had the fetish houses. And I had the privilege of being part of the team that did measurement of one of the fetish houses in Ejisu, Konongo. And there the buildings were built. That was the principal influence. Was built in a rectangular form. Rooms were added. There was often a veranda, but on the veranda and around the buildings there were adornments of various shapes. Some were Adikra influence, there were others. And they were also plastered. The interesting thing about the Ashanti roofs or Ashanti buildings were they were very steep, very, very steep roofs. If you see old pictures and photographs of the old Ashanti buildings, they are steep roofs. However, it was not a silly form of construction, if I may use the description. Scientifically, it was much better, because the steep roofs ensure that rain went off the roofs very quickly. The other thing was that the steepness of the roof also prevented wind from lifting the roofs up. Something for many years previously you hear about rainstorms ripping off all the roofs. It didn't happen that much with those roofs, but it would happen if your fastenings of the roof covers were poor. But it was a better way of doing it. So these types of structures went on until the influences came from the colonial past, where cement was now introduced, a stronger material. And we started putting up buildings with a lot of concrete mixes and like. So let's move to administrative buildings, because previously they were all houses and the chiefs will live in a similar size building, except where some of the compounds, like such as the Asantenis Palace, and those will be surrounded by buildings with passages to confuse people if they attack the building or the community. So they will have a pattern set that you will get lost in blank alleyways and the like. That was just to confuse you, and it became a little more complex through those systems. But the principal building material, as I said, were twigs, branches, and the like. Fairly short, because we didn't have the tools to climb and cut branches off. So we kept them to the length of maybe a log. So our doorways tended to be shorter than the doorways we see today. And if you look in some of the films that you see, even with the influence from Nigeria to the east, you find that the entranceways were short. And it's the same if you went up to the buildings of the north. Those practices have been largely kept. So we had these short doorways, and as I said, some of them just had maybe one window or two, because ventilation may not have been of such importance to them. However, in the northern areas where it is much hotter, you find that their walls were thicker. They used mud, but their walls were thicker. The advantage with that is that it took a long time for the heat to go through the walls. And by the time the walls got warmed up, it was evening. So the heat will be dissipated from the rooms. And that during the hot period, the daytime, you wouldn't want the heat to go into your rooms, The rooms will be cooled during the night, and they will stay cool throughout the day because of the thick walls. In a similar way, the roof construction with mud was such that it's also stayed cooler within those buildings. One good example you see of that, if it's still in good state of repair, is the Olgatanga Library, which has a double roof, mimicking something similar to the thick roof, where you didn't want the heat to go through the walls. The other use for the flat roofs in the north were for people to go up onto the roofs at night in the warm period and sleep up there, safe from serpents and the like, and safe from wild animals. So they had developed a double use of these flat roofs, something we could all learn from and use. So necessity brought some of these changes, and thinking through brought the question of protecting the walls with plaster and cow dung. For some of the buildings there, some of which have influenced some of the modern buildings we have in Ghana, the buildings were adorned with all sorts of geometric shapes as designs, and they were adorned in different colors, earthy colors, black, red, or you say rust color, and in very, very interesting designs. Made the buildings look very interesting and exciting. So that went a step further. Down south, we had the influence of the colonials with the cement. So we started building, the early buildings were the lighthouse, and there were a couple of bungalows on the Kwapi Mills, one of which was recently put in the newspapers. That was a retreat for the Dutch when they needed to rest. They obviously rode horses up the hill and rested there. But stone was also used where one could get their hands on stone. You can see it's limited in its use because we didn't have the tools to cut stone. We used to import stones for buildings, church buildings here, that were cut and shipped all the way from Europe. We wouldn't do that today because the cost would be prohibitive. So the cement houses and buildings spread to administrative buildings around the city. But in between, we started using wood and mud with verandas around them. Those were influenced partly by the cocoa, those who bought cocoa. And you find those sort of structures all over the south in the cocoa growing areas. You find a veranda typical of wood with balustrades in wood and a big overhang. And the structure from the ground up to the first floor was fairly tall, so they could store the cocoa beans. And it influenced a lot of buildings, not only in Ghana but in Cote d'Ivoire also. Similar buildings. And those balustrades with wood became a fashion some 10 years ago. Everybody wanted to build a house and put those verandas in. The most recent example which is readily seen is the Labadi Labadi Beach Hotel, which is maintained there. I think they borrowed a bit of that to use here locally. Going on from there, the Elmina Castle was built, but it was the earliest big structure which was put up here before these bungalows I was talking about, cocoa sheds. Then there was a lot more influence in buildings in and around Elmina and Cape Coast, where the colonials were, until the capital was moved to Accra. Then we had a lot more buildings. Let's look at another influence that came during that period. Still, we were not drawing any buildings. We were using our eyes. And if you typically wanted to build, you went outside, went to the plot of land that you were going to use. Mostly it was measured by strides, and you decided where you place your building, and just marked in the sand or the soil, and you started your building. No foundations were dug. The walls were just built on at that time until the colonial engineers came. We were not doing foundations really. Then we started building foundations, and the influence of the church. When all the German missionaries came, they also knew how to build a bit, so they also became an influence and put up a lot of buildings in the Akwapim, on the Akwapim Ridge. Some went as far as Kwewu also, because the weather there was conducive to them. So all these developed slowly. We weren't building very fast, and you can imagine that we were building with donkeys and buckets and the like, and a lot of manpower. Then the slave trade was on. So buildings in and around the city of Accra. You can imagine the boundaries of the city at that time. It was very small, just around the James Fort and around the what is known as the Salaga Market. I mentioned the history of Accra and the influences of the past history on development, and Salaga Market was one of the centers during the slave trade. And so it influenced the development of buildings around Ashford, between Ashford and James Fort in the Jamestown area. That is the area known as Otublo in Accra. And the slave traders, some of them Portuguese, some of them Dutch, the Dutch tried, but they didn't do so, built houses in that area, mainly to be able to ship out slaves. So the slaves were kept holding just around that area. A typical house will have a slave holding an area for horses, and the owner will live upstairs. And they'll have a big well in the middle if they could build it. That's where they stored their water. So along that street, if you are on the high street, what was the high street? And it's now called Attamills High Street. You'll find from Ashford you find on the left as you're going towards James, the lighthouse, you find a lot of buildings. Some have been preserved, a couple of them have collapsed or crumbled to the ground. And they had dungeons, because they are next to the sea. They had dungeons and they had an outlet down by the sea that slaves went into the canoes, and they were ferried across to the boats on a no return journey. Many of those buildings, the tunnels and passages have been sealed. And I understand they were sealed after the 66 coup. Oh no, before the 66 coup. They were sealed by then President Kwame Nkrumah. Just because of just to erase that history. But you know, history is something you can't erase easily. And on that same street, there is a curve that housed the first shop in Accra. And I think it was called Blue Shop or something. It still has its original plate there, bluish plate on it. Just after that, we had the Brazilian Quarter. And the Brazilian Quarter had a bit of influence on architecture here. Brazilian Quarter has the Tabon people, and they returned from Brazil just around the same time, 1836 or so, it was recorded that the first ones came back. They came with a lot of skills. There were a lot of tailors among them. There were a lot of builders among them. There were also farmers who had been cultivating all these, working the plantations. And they settled in that area. They were welcome, and they settled in that area. The builders amongst them started building in town, and they became popular. So when people wanted buildings put up, they called them. And the types of buildings they put up influence the landscape around the Central Railway Station Accra, Takoradi, and Kumasi. In fact, a lot of buildings in Kumasi have the influence of the type of architecture that the Tabon people brought. How we developed further. Now, if you look at buildings in the sub-region, that is Nigeria, going through to let's stop at Guinea. Beyond Guinea, you are moving to the Sahel. So it's difficult to differentiate and point at building types or building shapes or designs and say this is Ghanaian architecture or this is Nigerian architecture, or to describe any of the buildings there in terms of a particular country. Remember that the influence of the colonial divide did not cut across the way we build. However, today you will start seeing that we are starting to look back at some of the influences, positive influences from our own study of the environment. We're starting to see the positive aspects of open doors and overhangs that protect us from the sun. This is being influenced from our desire as human beings to build more environment-friendly buildings, or what we call green buildings, using what is available for us around us. So the old systems may have been more thoughtful because they were all user-friendly and renewable. You cut your twigs, you grew the bush again, you used it again. So then we got independence. And soon after that we became a republic. And the influences of Western development and the development of the countries to which are then government and head of state aligned. The Czechoslovakias and the Yugoslavia, those places which seemed quite advanced at that time, started agitating the president at the time. We need rapid development, technological development. So start getting architects, people to develop. So there comes University of Science and Technology, set up to train architects, set up to train engineers. So the first lot of architects or would-be architects, students were sent to the UK and some to what you call Eastern Europe at that time, to study in Bulgaria and all these things, and come back to serve the country. So formal education in architecture started. After some years, some of those architects returned to Ghana and started principally working for the British government, if you will, here, because the influences were then British. Then a few private firms moved into Ghana and also started designing buildings. So University of Ghana was designed by one of those groups. And I think their influence was from not Malta, the other country close to Malta. Then as the private firms came here, the influence of that grew, and a few British architects also set up their own firms. Then it started the Society of Architects in Ghana, which was mainly British, but a few of the Ghanaian trained architects also returned. And luckily, I know one who is still alive, or maybe two who are alive. One is Professor Oswado, who is in his 90s, has been blessed with many years. And he was one of the early architects who came back to the country. There's also Victor Adotei, but I think Victor Adotei died a few years. And then they started the Society of Architects, and that's developed into the Ghana Institute of Architects, and the rest is history. So the early architects, there were two architects, locally trained indigenous architects, who set up an architectural firm. And out of that firm, the second generation of architects, one of the second generation from those two architects works in my office now. And they designed a few buildings. I think the last one that was designed by them was the Bogota Hospital extension in those days. And unfortunately, those two architects have passed on. The cities which are well planned, normally you need to work with planners, trade planners, to be able to arrive at well-planned cities. And the obvious answer to Tema is that it was planned by a group called Doxiadis. And for largely the master plan of Tema has been followed. Also because I think the authorities who control the city, development of the city, were fairly fair. Therefore, they followed it as far as possible. Come and look at Osu and look at the other parts of Accra, the other districts. Osu developed around the Osu Castle. Who were the people? Traders. Traders wishing to make some money from the castle, bought their goods from the hinterland, and they settled. They settled like you say Kutubabi. Kutubabi, put your things somewhere, settle somewhere. And that's how it started. So what did they build with? Very, very cheap materials. Because they looked at themselves as transient people. They were emissaries who came to Accra and did some trading and went back. And that incidentally is how my family is supposed to have developed. And well, they didn't write anything, so we only know it from story to story. So the settlements grew, and the settlements grew because there were no vehicular traffic then. It was all foot and horses. And so narrow lanes, ventilation was a problem. People didn't know how closeness of buildings to each other affected health. And so they just put every building where they could. No plan. So you find Osu is a mess. But a typical Osu person knows, well, this Osu Aneho, this Osu Asante, they all know it because they know their boundaries without anything being written. So it was an unplanned development. And to do anything about it, we would now need quite a large intervention. But it has been done. Nima, some years ago, was also a settlement similar to that. Kutubabi was a settlement similar to that. But Nima developed into from a small village life to a very large area. There have been interventions by the World Bank, and so we've had roads which have been put in, and it has made movement around much better. So our cities and towns, if they are unplanned and uncontrolled, will develop just like what I call an unfortunate heap. If we have interventions and there's order, law and order, then things move well. Luckily, Laboni was developed. Ringway Estate, to a large extent, because that was developed by African Concrete, AC. Then, which other estate? You find Teshinungwa State Housing, fairly ample spaces, plenty of breeze, and nice house. So those areas which were well planned, like the airport residential area and the cantonments was planned, but that was for the senior echelon of the civil service and colonial military officers. So they got their land in very large sizes and they stayed there. But those areas have been respected and they remain clean and uncongested. Where man has not followed the rules, we get chaos. So there's something to be said for law and order and encroachment. The design of buildings is very important, and before you build, or one starts building, this is where you need to assemble a team of designers and professionals. One, to look at the best way to send vehicles around a building and to send vehicles in and around the building. Second one is to look at whether there are potential dangers in that area. First one you look at is flood. Very, very important for the design of homes or offices. First thing, you go on a plot. First of all, the architect needs to go and stand on the plot and look at it before you send instruments to the site. You need to look at the plot and see with your eyes whether there is a potential for disaster there. And one of the early things we look out for is a possible flood level. There are telltale signs that an area can flood. And with that in mind, especially if you are buying a plot of land, you must know. But if you go to a site, and very often when there is someone trying to sell a poor quality plot of land, a piece of land that floods most of the time, the person will try and sell it in the dry season. But if you go to a site and you see the presence of some reeds only do well in water. So if you see the presence of reeds in a corner of the plot or part of the plot, know that this is not a plot of land you should be buying. If there's clay on the site, you have to think twice and again get an engineer to look at it. Then you look at the influences around you. Who is developing what or who has developed what? And therefore, how does it influence your building? If the person's building catches fire, how will it influence your building? How can people from the building that is next door to you, how can it influence your building when it's up? If there's a fire, will the flames jump over to your building or not? If there's, you mentioned an earthquake, if there's an earthquake, a building starts collapsing, how does it influence your building? Will part of a building collapse onto your building or not? And this is why when people are told to set back their buildings from the end or the boundaries, we are told, for now, keep your building at least 8 feet or 9 feet or 2.85 meters from the boundary on the sides, because you should be able to fight a fire on the side if there happens to be a fire. So you look at all these disasters that could happen. Then you tend to look at what do we need next. You want the levels to confirm. So you get a geodetic engineer to come and look at the soil and give you levels. It's from that your design will be influenced. Okay, well, if it floods, it's likely to flood and come up, let's say, a meter, 3 feet, let's say. So where should the ground floor end? So you say, okay, my flood level is there, therefore my building, the floor will end 3 feet above the ground. Then that is a design influence. And you continue your design that way. I'll give you an example of a project we had up in Howe. The building was such that the ground sloped away from it very steeply. And we had to put a single-story building there. When we put up the building, we knew that all the water that would come onto the plot and beyond the building will flow backwards. And we're ending up about 7.5 feet above ground, 2.1 meters. So we had to reverse the direction of flow from our building so it could go onto the road drain. If you don't look at that, your neighbors will be angry with you every time. When you're building, every time it rains, you say, look at these silly people, they've come to put a building there. So that is how your building is influenced by design. Then again, similarly, you look at escape from a building. How are your staircases aligned? How do people run out of your building? How do they run out without running into the street? Can they run out easily, or if they can't run out, do you have balconies that they can go on and be rescued by fire service? Can they move easily? Can, let's say, 2 people run easily when there's a fire? Can they run abreast each other and run out of the building? Are your balustrades going to be strong enough to hold people as they scramble out? Mind you, when there's a fire or there's an earthquake, the person in front of you, or let's say the person behind you, just doesn't care if you want to go out. He or she also wants to go out. At that time, just like escaping from an aircraft, they will pull you back, so they will go. When you panic, this reason doesn't come in. So that's the design thinking you should put in place before you put a building anywhere. What are 5 things you should consider when you want to build? First should be a plot of land. How big should it be? How wide? How is it oriented to the sun? How is it oriented to the wind and noise in the area? So it's not just a plot, but the influences around. How high should this be from the ground? It's all part of the influences of plot. Then secondly, you should know that you are living in an organized society. So organized society goes with laws and rules. So there are regulations around buildings. Most people ignore that and say, it's my land, I'll do what I want. And that's where the chaos starts. So be observant and cognizant of the laws around. If you do not know, ask for advice. Third, what do I want to build? What is the land use requirement for the area? Who should I get permission from before I start building on the land that I bought myself? Fourth, who should I consult to design my buildings for me? You need minimum of 4 professionals, but generally these days you need about 6. Architect, planner, structural engineer, mechanical engineer, electrical engineer. Those are the basics. You need an environmental scientist in many cases. Then you need a geodetic engineer. In the case of bigger buildings, you need a geotechnical engineer and a traffic impact assessment engineer or a traffic engineer. Then you need a fire consultant because you need all these permits, many permits before you can continue. Yeah, finally, the 5th one is that you must know the construction method you are going to use the materials you are going to use, how much it's going to cost you. Put the money aside, or at least know where you're going to get all the money, so that you can complete the building and not have just walls up above the ground and an unroofed building, which is about what you see in about 25% of buildings around the country. Just skeletons of buildings. It's sad to see that.